The reason we all are here is because of Heina Dadabhoy. I don't know how many of you read her blog on free thoughts. It's called Heina's Dealings. A wonderful title. I love it. But today she's going to talk to us about botched comparisons, shared origins, Islam and Christianity. So, awesome. Come on up on stage. I'm just going to leave this thing up here. Would you like me to turn the screen off so it doesn't...
Yeah, sure.
There we go. There we go. And let me clean up a little bit so you don't trip and fall.
All right. I mean, I was just talking earlier about how clumsy I am, so I appreciate that. Alrighty, so, last time that someone tried to make me sing in a group, it was Sunday Assembly, and it was weird. And it's actually a perfect thing to talk about because people assume that that sort of churchy experience of everybody singing together is somehow universal. It's not. It's weird. I'm just going to tell you that. For me, it's weird. For me, it's like, it's not at all analogous to my experiences in the house of worship that I used to attend, where I was expected to be quiet because my voice was too sexy. No kidding. No, not me personally, just women. So that's a perfect way for me to start talking about Islam and Christianity. So they do have shared origins, as most of you probably know. They're called the Abrahamic faiths sometimes, along with Judaism, which, Judaism was the original, and Christianity was the spin-off, and Islam was the fan fiction that came in and rewrote some things, took some things, took not other things, I've gotten into knockdown, drag down arguments when I was a Muslim with Jews and Christians because in Islam, with the Abraham story where he was going to sacrifice his son, it's Ishmael and not Isaac because Ishmael was the founder of the Arabs, right? So that's what Muhammad did. He kind of rewrote some things. Now I don't care. It's nice to not have a dog in that fight. Yeah. What ended up happening was, so you got all these three religions, right? And you have a country like the United States, which is not a Christian nation, but a Christian majority nation. And you have people of all different religions here. And most of us sort of have this understanding intrinsically of Christianity, whether or not we are Christians. So I understood more about Christianity than my peers understood about Islam. And that's kind of the place where we all end up right now. That's kind of what we do. And because of that, Muslims sometimes feed this comparison notion between Islam and Christianity. They try to figure out equivalence so that people can understand. But it ends up being sometimes a little bit awkward. Or, sometimes Christians or people of Christian origin come up with analogies that aren't quite right. So the big one, this is probably the one that most people get wrong, is Muhammad versus Jesus. People think, you've got Allah and God, Jesus and Muhammad. Despite the fact that people kill and die over Muhammad's image being drawn, Muhammad is not the savior in Islam. He's not. He's the last prophet. And Muslims actually believe in Jesus too, just not as the son of God or the savior. Well, he's the savior for the end times, which is another fun thing I'll talk about. Eschatology, the end of the world. That's a fun one. But yeah, Muhammad is not the savior in Islam. Salvation in Islam comes through the Quran. So if you're going to compare who the Jesus of Islam is, it's not a who, it's a what. It's the Quran. The Quran is, supposed to be this unchanged, perfect thing that, came directly from heaven onto earth and can't be translated. It can only be interpreted. And as Muslims, we were taught that, the Quran is how you get your salvation in life. You follow the Quran. And of course, the loophole or the little extra thing there is that Muhammad was considered to be the embodiment of the Quran. So that's kind of where a little bit of the savior thing comes in, but it's not quite the same. Muhammad was supposed to be the person who lived the values of the Quran and was the best Muslim, and so that's why Muslims emulate him and revere him, but he's not considered to be a god. And then there's the whole Allah versus God thing. People say, Allah and God. They're really kind of the same thing. I mean, people will fight each other over this. They may say that that's wrong, but ultimately they're the same monotheistic deity that people think of. So that's kind of the same thing there. Sometimes the botched comparisons get weird, like I mentioned. You get things that are forbidden or emphasized in Christianity as a bad thing that aren't in Islam, and vice versa. I know that's hard to believe. It seems like Islam has a lot of rules, and it does. But there are things that are forbidden or frowned upon in Christianity that Muslims don't even care that much about. One of the big ones probably is Christians, maybe it's just me as an atheist looking at biased sources, because we're all biased in our own special ways. It seems like Christians are really obsessed with masturbation. It really seems to be like that's what they're really wanting to police their kids on. And Muslims actually aren't that concerned about masturbation. The prohibition in Islam against masturbation is very weak. There are a million other rules in Islam that are far more emphasized and important. There's actually, internal theistic debate among Muslims about whether or not masturbation is okay. But in Christianity, it's very much considered to be bad, don't do it. Horrible things will happen to you. And it doesn't help that we have pseudoscience from the Victorian era sort of reinforcing that. On the other hand, though, like I said, Islam has lots of rules that seem very weird to outsiders. There's a lot of rules about various things. A lot of things, one of the things that outsiders seem to fixate on is the treatment of women, understandably, because it's a very visual representation. You've got all these covered up people. But of course, Muslims like to make the comparison with nuns. That's a botched comparison too, right? Because nuns are not your average Christian woman. They are Catholics who have committed themselves. Whereas in Islam, all women are supposed to be covered to some extent. And of course, there's internal debate about that too. And that's actually another thing that makes it hard for outsiders to really understand Islam, is that there's so many versions of Islam. One of the faulty things that I've been told, and I've had to try to argue with someone about this, I gave a talk about Islam a couple of years ago in Seattle, and this guy came up to me afterwards and insisted to me that there was a secret council of Muslims that decided what all Muslims believed. And I had the laugh of my life, because you can walk into a mosque and say the word, say meat, and start a riot. Because Muslims argue about everything. Because there is no one set rule that's set forth in Islam, especially Sunni Islam. So the two main sects of Islam, I would say, are Shiite and Sunni. And Sunnis are more like Protestants in that Sunnis kind of make their own rules, they do their own thing, they do their own interpretation. Whereas Shiites are more like Catholics. They have a hierarchy, and they have certain people that pass down certain knowledges, and they have to all believe what their leader tells them. Of course, I knew some wrong things about Shiism, because as coming from a Sunni family, we were taught that Shia were, bad and not real Muslims. But yeah, the difference there, though, is that Protestantism, I know, came after Catholicism, whereas Sunnism came first. So, the original Muslims. So people don't know that Muslims have different ideas. And so one Muslim might tell you something, and it may not be what another Muslim believes. And that's true for all religions, as we know. Of course, there's some things you can justify a little bit more canonically. The thing that comes to mind for me, too, is don't forget that living in a Western society as a Muslim is hard. And so a lot of Muslims will, they'll sort of encourage misunderstandings of Islam because they want Islam to look good. They don't want you to think they're terrorists. There's this sort of sense of fear and justification, especially now. I mean, with Trump calling for things like, Muslims being interned or, internment camps like Japanese World War II style, it's like 9/11 all over again. I'm not even kidding you. It's weird. But the weird part is, and I feel kind of bad for saying this, but I'm so glad I left Islam at this point. Because I think about my poor mother out in her headscarf and what she must be going through. But a lot of Muslims will sort of soften Islam for outsiders. My favorite example is one of my friends saying to me, oh, as a Muslim, why did you find it hard to follow Islam? Because it was hard. There were a lot of rules. I said, I had to stop everything I was doing in the middle of the day and pray 5 times a day, because that's one of the things that Muslims are supposed to do. And prayer, by the way, is not like, dear God, I want a pony, amen. Like, that's not the prayer I'm talking about. That's a supplication. That's a prayer. The Muslim prayer that they do 5 times a day, it's a ritual. You have to bow and kneel and recite certain prayers and all that. And most Muslims don't speak Arabic, so they don't even know what they're saying. But that's another talk. But yeah, one of my friends said, my Muslim coworker says Islam allows for Muslims to not inconvenience themselves or non-Muslims And I said, run that one by me again. And apparently she works in a research lab, and her Muslim coworker, they go on excursions. So they go out, and her coworker will make up his prayers later because he says that he doesn't want to inconvenience everyone else, and Allah allows that. I remember thinking, where's the kafir clause in Islam? Kafir means like non-Muslim, no, but that's a whole other thing too. But where's the kafir clause in Islam for if you inconvenience a non-Muslim, you don't have to follow the rules? That's not true. That's not a thing that ever happens. But that's something that, a lot of Muslims will do. They will sort of essentially try to soften the blow for non-Muslims. That's actually something that I was guilty of doing to some extent as a Muslim, especially after 9/11, but, I don't do it anymore. I don't pull any punches anymore because I'm not really trying to justify anything anymore. Although I will defend to the death the idea that Donald Trump is wrong. Probably. And not just about the internment camp thing. Oh, is it too loud? Oh, all right. All right.
You can hold it in your hands.
Yeah, I guess so. I could do that. That might be easier. Okay. All right. Another comparison that people make between Islam and Christianity is faith versus works. So in some versions of Christianity, you're supposed to just believe and you're saved and you're done. And Muslims actually mock Christians for this. We would sit around and go, oh man, Christians could be axe, murderer, rapists, embezzlers, but they just say, Jesus saves, and then they die and they get to go to heaven. You gotta work for that salvation. You gotta earn it. And there are some branches of Christianity I know where that's true. But faith is essential in Islam, but not the only thing. And there is no purgatory in Islam, but hell itself can serve as a purgatory in the Islamic belief. So if you're a Muslim, which all you have to do to be a Muslim, by the way, is you just have to say the declaration of faith once and mean it and never recant. That's all. Which is why you have Cupid's Muslims, as I like to call them. In Islam, this is the whole thing with Islamic marriage. Muslim men are allowed to marry Jewish and Christian women. And they do, a lot of them. Which is why a lot of my Muslim friends are unmarried, the women, because all these guys go out and marry white girls, because they can. Whereas, they can't. In Islam, Muslim women are not supposed to marry non-Muslim men. So when they want to marry their non-Muslim boyfriends, they have them convert. They go to the mosque, they put on the little cap, they say the little words, the magic spell that somehow makes their marriage okay. And then they get their Islamic marriage done. That's how they do it. They're called Cupid's Muslims, men who aren't actually interested in converting. They're just doing it for their girlfriends. But, as long as they don't recant in public, it's considered to be okay. I have recanted, by the way, publicly multiple times. So, official apostate. Yeah. Well, yeah, I needed that applause 10 years ago when I left Islam. And my parents had me convinced that I was the only person on the planet that had left Islam and that I was crazy and I was alone. But, thankfully now there's lots of ex-Muslim organizations. There weren't back then. But in Islam, you get your foot in the door with your declaration of faith. But you have to do the actions in order to avoid hell entirely. So what happens if you're a sinner? What if you're a Muslim who said the words, never recanted, but, don't actually follow the rules? You go to hell for a little while and get the sins scorched off you. It's basically what happens. And then Muhammad shows up and says, oh, this person, they were a sinner, but they were part of the community. Allah, please. And he sort of does this intercession thing in the afterlife, and then you get to go to heaven eventually. But a low level of heaven. The afterlife in Islam, by the way, is ridiculously intricate. It is nothing at all like Christian heaven. Christian heaven seems boring by comparison. It is. What are you, playing harps? And, well, I mean, I have a pastor friend, believe it or not. Philosophy major, by the way. In a philosophy department, you will find the most ardent atheists and the most ardent theists. That's seriously where you find them, on campus. And so one of my friends is now a Christian pastor. He's moved across the country. He blogs at Patheos, which has an atheist channel, but he blogs on the Christian channel. And we run into each other on the internet all the time because of this. But he told me that heaven in Christianity, and this seems to bear out with what I've researched, is basking in the presence of God. Like, you're just happy because you get to be with God. Islamic heaven is a whole other story. Like I mentioned, there are levels. So if you're not that great of a person, you get, the small mansion and a million pearls. And then, if you go up to the 7th layer of heaven, then you get a million mansions and a gazillion pearls, I guess. I don't know. I mean, they don't actually talk about numbers there. What they do talk about with numbers, and this is something a lot of people like to bring up, is the virgins that everybody likes to talk about. The 72 virgins. Everybody's obsessed with this. Everyone wants to ask me about this, right? Because they think it's weird. What's 72? Why 72 virgins? And the thing is with the 72 virgins is that saying 72 in that form of Arabic is like saying, if I told you once, I told you 1,000 times. I don't literally mean I told you 1,000 times. It means I said it a lot. Could you stop? So 72 just means a lot. And then they wonder, why are they virgins? Well, not long ago, even in Western societies, men used to consider sex with an untouched virgin to be the best thing in the whole world. This was true for a long time in all societies. And so this was true in Muhammad's time. That's what they thought. And then you wonder, once you have sex with them, they're not virgins anymore, right? Allah thought of that. Or Muhammad did, rather. Because that's really who's talking, right? The virgins are like Aphrodite in Greek mythology. She would go to her special fountain and re-virginate herself. So that's what the virgins in heaven do. They're just constantly virgins for some reason. Yeah. Well, actually, they're not real women either. They're sex bots that God created. I'm not even kidding you. So the big reward in heaven for men in Islam is you get to go to heaven and have sex bots. Which, I could see why that would be tempting. Not particularly tempting if you don't get sex bots, though, if you're a woman. Although there is sort of suggestiveness in the Quran about that. So the Quran talks about the women of heaven, the good Muslim women who get to go to heaven. They recline on couches being served by beautiful serving boys. What else you get out of the serving boys? Who knows? What else they're serving up? The daily special? I don't know. But the Shia Islam actually explicitly says, no, those serving boys are sex hunks for women. And I've even heard Shia and some Sunni scholars say the reward, if you're, like, in Islam, they actually do acknowledge homosexuality in the sense that that's another difference between Christianity. I'd say a lot of Christians deny that homosexuality is real. There's a lot of, ex-gay conversion narrative going on where people say, oh, you're not actually gay, you were just raped as a child, so therefore, let's fix you. Or you're not gay, you had too close of a relationship with your mother. Or you're not gay, you're just socially awkward with women. They have all these ridiculous things. And there's a lot of good writing about the former ex-gay movement. And I say former ex-gay because the biggest ex-gay organization is called Exodus. And it was run by two men who claimed to be ex-gay. And they fell in love with each other and disbanded it. So it's great. It's a great love story, right? It's amazing. Great 2015 modern age love story. But in Islam, actually, homosexuality is 100% acknowledged. Muhammad said, yes, there are people who are like this, but that is your test in life. So in Islam, they advocate for celibacy if you're gay. Or, if you're bi, you only have sex with people of the other gender, if you believe in just two genders, I guess. But in Islam, there are scholars who claim that if you're a good Muslim gay and you don't have sex with someone of the same gender while you're alive, in heaven, you will get the appropriate sex stud or, sex bot. That's your reward. And, they say it like it's no big deal. They say, oh, everybody has their test in life. Some people are gay. Some people really like listening to music. Some people really want to shave their beards off. But, we still have to follow the rules. And I'm not even kidding you. I had a religious teacher make this comparison. All these sort of very trivial things to being gay. And I'm thinking, what? That seems really unfair that God would do that. But, then they get the chance to get more reward in heaven. And that's another difference, too, with Christianity. With Christianity, once you're saved, right? Even if you're Catholic, you're supposed to act a certain way. But, heaven is heaven. Sins are sins, But in Islam, there's like a point-based system. There's major sins and minor sins, big good deeds and small good deeds. And we were taught as children that there are two angels, one on each shoulder, one that records good deeds and one that records bad deeds. That is a very scary thing to tell a child. that somebody's watching you all the time and writing down everything you do. And then we were told the names of them, and I remember thinking, how are they on everybody's shoulders simultaneously? There's an explanation for that, too. Apparently there are helper angels. So the main ones are up in heaven somewhere, and then they have their little designated helper angels who sit on your shoulder. There's a lot of weird and fun stuff in Islam, I'll tell you that. I could go on about that forever. But with that in mind, I know generally when I do talks about Islam, everybody's burning with questions, especially since I casually drop mentions of weird things in Islam and then never get back to them. So I think I'm going to open it up right now.
Okay, let's get a microphone. If you guys come this way. Think of questions.
I could keep going, but I'm sure there's lots of questions. That happens a lot.
Oh, I disconnected her, honey. Sorry. I don't know how to connect it now. Oh, never mind, I found it.
I could always repeat questions if it's not going to work.
Oh, here we go.
All right, there we go. Go ahead and start here, yeah. Here we go. Just pass it down.
Being that you left a Muslim faith, is your life in danger? I'm not saying that to be funny, but you hear about honor killings and stuff. Are you in danger?
Okay, so there's a couple of things in your question. So first of all, we all have heard of famous ex-Muslims who have death threats on their heads. Salman Rushdie, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, people like that, Ibn Warraq. I'm not a best-selling novelist. I'm not a Dutch politician. Because I'm kind of nobody, I don't warrant a fatwa. That's what it is. They don't see me as much of a threat. Maybe someday, though. I can't wait for that fatwa. Then I will be a bestseller. I know that. Honor killings are a phenomenon that are somewhat separate from that. Killing an apostate would not be classified in the same vein. Honor killings are essentially when people feel that their family has been shamed in some way by the actions of their children, especially young women, because there are more rules for it in most Islamic cultures. And so, they'll kill their daughters for shaming the family. It's more analogous to, I'd say, domestic violence than anything. It's just a particular form of it, and one that sort of stands out to a lot of people. But yeah, I'm not in any danger. My family and I, we fought for years and years and years. We're okay now, and we just don't talk about religion. A lot of atheists here probably can relate. Thanksgiving's coming up, right? We just avoid the topic entirely. They say, oh, I thank God and the family. And I'm like, I don't thank God. I thank all of you. You all made the food. God didn't. My husband was slaving over the fryer, not God. Please thank him. But yeah, thankfully, yeah. And part of it, too, is also there are more and more ex-Muslims out every day. So when Ayaan Hirsi Ali came out as an atheist, 10, 15 years ago, it was a big deal because nobody was out as an ex-Muslim. And now there are ex-Muslim organizations all over the world. There's the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain. That was the first big one. Then they had a France one and a Dutch one. There's Ex-Muslims of North America now, which I'm part of. I'm not in leadership there, just to be clear. I don't represent them, but I'm a member. And, we're around. You can Google ex-Muslim. And before, what you would find, by the way, was Christian websites. People who had left Islam and found Jesus. Because Allah was too mean, so they found Jesus, who they thought was nicer, I guess. I could see the appeal, but no thank you for me. But now when you search ex-Muslims, you actually find a lot of atheist ex-Muslim organizations. So there's too many of us to issue fatwas on all of us now. What are they going to do? Kill us all? I mean, they could try. It would be difficult, though. Yeah, so I joke sometimes, and, it's a serious matter, but I don't like to sit and sort of get myself into that rut, but I joke all the time that if I do die, they're just going to prove me right. Because Muslims love to tell me that they're not that angry about me. I'm like, well, if one of you kills me, then clearly I'm right, so.
The microphone is too short, so if you want questions, line up here. And I have a question. You have a book coming out soon. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
It's called A Skeptic's Guide to Islam. The Amazon date is incorrect. It's coming out early next year, not this month. It's been severely delayed. If you kickstarted me, I'm very sorry. But as it turns out, working full-time and running a household and writing a book, very difficult to do simultaneously. But yeah, it's essentially my perspective on Islam as an American born and raised Muslim, and understanding from other people what most average Americans without Muslim background don't know about Islam. And essentially giving people a primer and a starter and a basic understanding, and then they can take that and run with it. And I have a huge bibliography I'm working on where, or a recommended reading really, where I say, all right, now that you know these things, you can read more. So that's the idea, is to get people to understand a little bit.
Hi, first of all, thank you. It was excellent insight. It was really informative and very helpful. So I'm a kafir, my girlfriend is a Muslim, and when she dies, she's going to burn in hell, and I'm going to be the coals under which she burns. From what I understand, I'm not going to feel it, so I don't need to bring marshmallows. But is there anything I could tell her to make her feel better about her future?
Oh gosh, that's tough. That's really tough. I mean, because when I was Muslim, I was very Muslim. I wasn't dating white boys back then. No, I waited till I was an atheist to do that. Yeah, that's tough. I mean, there are lots of Muslims who, sort of do that now. They don't actually follow all the rules. I guess you can tell her that, there are a lot of weird little cute stories in Islam. This is where Islam and Christianity are similar, where they have cute little stories about God's mercy and forgiveness. So there's one story that my mom used to tell me about where, there was a woman and she was said to be a prostitute and she'd just been sinning her whole life. But one day she gave water to a thirsty dog and she got to go to heaven for that. So, I don't know, foster animals, you could tell her that. I am a cat foster myself. So I feel like that actually makes my family like me more, because there are all these stories in Islam of people being kind to animals and all their sins being forgiven. So I think my mom is happy that I foster cats just in case. That might be my out of hell. Feeding and taking care of sick little kittens until they're well. It's cute though, that's why I do it. All right. Dogs are, I know a lot of people know that Muslims don't like dogs, and it's because their saliva is considered to be unclean. So if you get licked by a dog, you have to wash yourself 7 times. So that's why Muslims tend to avoid dogs. But in Islam, you're allowed to keep a dog as long as it's not in your house. And, like I mentioned, the first story, the cute story of someone being forgiven because of a good deed, it was for a dog. And so, it's not like Muslims are supposed to maltreat dogs. But even though they do, it's pretty sad. Yes.
I just finished reading Infidel by Ayn Hershey Ali. From what I understand from the book, her idea to correct Islam, we don't seem to have problems with Islam here in the United States, but in many European countries and African countries where they're still circumcising young women, she feels that the cure for Islam is to have a renaissance. So what is your opinion?
Well, she's actually changed a lot since Infidel. I follow her work pretty closely for obvious reasons. She spoke at American Atheists this year. She believes Islam needs a reformation, because at the end of Infidel, she said it needs a renaissance. And then in her second book, she claimed we needed to convert Muslims to Christianity. And she's backtracked on that. She said that she was wrong, because I think she's discovered in the West that Christianity isn't much better. It's better in some ways, but not so much in other ways. But my view is that reform is already happening in Islam. The first sign, I think, that makes religions reform is when people start leaving it openly. And there's so many of us leaving openly. I've seen it happen in my own family, where, my family was more strict about certain things, and I left Islam, and suddenly they're reconsidering and trying to be nicer with their kids, I guess, about religion. Even though that's not why I left Islam. I didn't leave Islam because I thought the rules were too hard. I followed all the rules. I left Islam because I didn't believe in it anymore. But I think a reform is already happening, and I think we need to encourage it. And this, I know a lot of atheists hate, but I think the first thing we need to do is just sort of acknowledge that not everyone's going to become an atheist, and encourage people who are liberals and reformers in religion. Even if we think they're hypocrites, even if we think they're not following their own religion, it's better for them to push their soft version of religion than for them to continue to do harm, I think, in the name of their religion. So
One other question. Pagans tried to kill Christianity by feeding them to the lions, and it didn't work. So it's obvious that lions and bullets don't kill an ideology. What do we do with terrorists?
That's where sort of reform comes in too, I think, and also addressing the underlying issues. You know, the global politics of terrorism in various forms are really complex. But usually what ends up happening is, you know, someone being in a religion isn't usually enough to make them a terrorist. There are other factors as well that factor into radicalization. And I think those factors really need to be addressed, and often they aren't.
What are they?
It depends on the situation you're talking about. There's many different terrorist groups in many different areas doing many different things. So I think it's important to look at each specific one rather than just sort of make a sweeping statement of this is the problem and this is how we fix it. I know, it's not fun, right? It's not fun when I have I don't have fun, quippy answer. But that's life, right?
I'm curious to hear your opinion. Why has Islam been so popular in converting situations in Asia? It seems like they had their local, everybody starts out with the local belief, like Shinto or Buddhism, and then Christianity had a big missionary push around the world, and that's sort of dying out. And Islam is, do they actively go out seeking, like the Christians used to, sending missionaries, or how, and why is it so popular in Asia? Thank you.
What part of Asia are you addressing? Yeah, I can't answer your question without knowing what countries you're talking about. Yeah.
Why is Islam so popular in Asia?
Which country, though? Okay, because there are Asian countries that are already Muslim majority.
Indonesia.
You know, you got Indonesia, Malaysia, India has a huge Muslim population. Pakistan is a Muslim country explicitly. These are all in Asia. So in those countries, it's because it has a history of Islam already. Indonesia and Malaysia became Islamified because of trading routes. Arab traders came and brought Islam. And it's sort of a more diplomatic Islam in some ways because of that. The Islam you find in the subcontinent in India and Pakistan was brought by conquerors, the Mughals. So that's why you get sort of a different strain of Islam that way. Islam is called the fastest growing religion in the world, but that's not because of conversion. That's a myth. It's because of birth rate.
No.
It's mostly birth rate. And the people who convert to Islam in the Western countries, everyone likes to write down the numbers of people who convert to Islam. They never look at people who leave. And actually, people who convert to Islam and leave in Western countries who aren't of Muslim origin, that's a very common story. And it's one that I'm really interested in finding out more about. Because an author I follow online for reasons that have nothing to do with atheism, he turned out to have been local to me when I was a child, and he converted at one of our local mosques, and he left eventually. So this is more common than we know. We just don't know about it yet. I think there was one small study that was done that showed that most people who aren't of Muslim origin who convert to Islam tend to leave eventually. Because it starts out with, oh, this Muslim community is so nice and they're embracing me. And then you become a Muslim and you find out, oh, there's all these rules and everybody's judging me for not following them. So that's not fun. But yeah, there are Muslims who do dawah, they call it. Dawah is preaching, essentially, trying to convert people. There are groups that do go to non-Muslims to do it, but the biggest dawah groups do dawah within the Muslim community. They want Muslims to be more Muslim. But Muslims do like converts. They love them. You know, they'll join the mosque, and everyone wants their daughter to marry them because they assume that a convert must know about more about Islam than someone who's born into it, because they had to research it to find it. So yeah, no, Muslims love converts, but and there are groups that do it. But yeah, the growth really is birth rate.
Yes, I was wondering, well, for example, leaving Christianity was very easy for me. I left in my early teens. I left the Presbyterian Church, and nobody tried to get me back in or anything. Would you say that on the whole, that it's easier to leave Christianity than it is to leave Islam?
Yes. Mm-hmm. The answer to that is very much yes. Mm-hmm. Unless you're a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon or, you know, any of those smaller groups of Christians that are much more strict, a lot of that has to do, I would say, especially with Western Muslims, it has a lot to do with being an immigrant or the child of immigrants. You know, immigrants tend to cling to their home culture when they immigrate. They assimilate some, but they also tend to sort of have a nostalgia version of what their past used to be like, and they sort of try to enforce that on their children. And so that makes it harder for those of us who are the children of immigrants and leave Islam, because our parents see it as a betrayal of who we are. People have said things to me, you think you're like those white people, but you're not. And, they're thinking that I'm betraying my heritage by changing my beliefs. I didn't really change my beliefs. I stopped believing. I don't know if I really had any agency in that. But yeah, it is harder, especially, and part of it too, I think even all over the world, not just in the West, Muslims feel like they're being attacked on all sides. They feel like their countries don't have a lot of wealth and power, and the U.S. is just trying to take over everything. And so they think that, they're being attacked, and so they sort of double down. And the idea of their own children leaving their faith is just upsetting to them. And they'll accuse ex-Muslims of being Zionist agents or being paid by the global conspiracy to make Islam look bad for some reason. I always ask them, where's my check then? Where is my secret Jew money? I don't know. There's so much anti-Semitism going on there too, by the way. I don't condone that at all. Just they talk about it that way. But yeah, that's why actually I would say when I first left Islam and I couldn't find other ex-Muslims, ex-Jehovah's Witnesses and ex-Mormons were my best friends because they understood what it was like. They really do. My best friend in the whole world, we've been friends for over 10 years, is an ex-Mormon, and there's a good reason for that. She is an atheist, yes. Usually when people leave a religion and convert to another, they don't identify as ex insert religion here. You know what I mean? People who become atheists tend to identify as ex-Mormon or ex-Christian, whereas people who convert to another religion just start identifying as that religion. They'll just say, I'm a Christian now, or I'm a Catholic now, or whatever. Yes.
Thanks for your talk. You were making parallels between Christianity and Islam. Mm-hmm. Is there an Islamic Satan?
Yes. Cool. He is named very cleverly Shaitan, like Satan, but not. But Arabicized. And in Islam, he's not an angel who fell. He's a separate class of being called a jinn. And so he was a jinn who was apparently so pious he got to hang out with the angels in heaven. But then God asked him to prostrate himself in front of Adam, the first man who God had just created. And Satan refused, saying, he's not a superior creature to me. And actually, there are versions of Islam, the more spiritual ones called Sufis. They believe that Satan is the best Muslim because he refused to bow to anybody but God. So they have their own little twist on that. But they're a minority. Most Muslims hate Satan, right? And yeah, so when Satan was banished from heaven onto earth, then, it's the same thing where he's supposed to tempt people and then, bring them to hell with him. Muslim hell is fun too. That's a whole other thing I could talk about, but... and Muslims actually have one fun belief too. And try this if you know any Muslims during Ramadan. So Muslims believe that in Ramadan, Satan is chained up. Like he can't tempt people. So if you do any sins in Ramadan, it's you and not Satan. So, yeah, that's a fun one. All right, yes.
Hi. Thanks again. I am really enjoying this, learning a lot. But I wondered, one thing it seemed to me that's fundamentally different between Islam and Christian religions is that Islam is also, it's not just a religion, it's a political engine. In other words, Muhammad had aspirations for governmental power as well as, telling people what to do in his religion. And I think that's a fundamental difference that leads to the theocratic states, that leads to the difficulty of having church-state separation in Muslim countries. So I just wondered, have you been thinking about it that way? That people are saying you shouldn't attack Islam because it's a religion, but it's not just a religion. It's kind of religion plus a kind of fascist, state. So I just wondered what you think about that.
Well, I think the history of both Islam and Christianity do sort of affect how they manifest themselves in the world. There's no question there. Jesus was essentially, a rebellious rabbi who got killed. Muhammad was a guy who basically created an empire, and one that went on after his death. Of course, it split up, and there were internal problems and civil wars, and you name it. But yeah, that does affect how Muslims view themselves, I would say that, and it does affect the world. But I'd say that Christians have done a great job of overcoming their pacifistic origins with Jesus and trying to impose, the American Taliban trying to impose their version of Sharia in the United States. Hats off to them, despite their history. They've managed to become almost just as fascist. But yeah, it does affect how Muslims think of themselves. I mean, even someone who you might call a more moderate Muslim thinks that the Islamic State would solve a lot of problems in the world. But they view it in different ways. They'll say, oh, Sharia would solve everything, but the Sharia that you're thinking of or that I might think of is not the Sharia they're thinking of. I've had someone say to me, oh, Sharia is great. I'm like, under Sharia, I would be killed. And they said, oh, that's not what I meant. I just meant no more interest and no more, hurting the poor and more charity. And I'm like, well, what Sharia are you talking about? But, that's how they think of it in their heads. They think of it as what they personally take from their religion, because all the religious people pick and choose. Of course they do. They think that the nice things that they've picked and chosen are what they want to implement on the world. And I think that's how a lot of religious people think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Every time there's an attack on an atheist blogger in Bangladesh or elsewhere in the world, we get into a renewed discourse on freedom of speech in Islamic countries and the ubiquity of blasphemy laws there. And every time I go back and forth with this with some of my Muslim friends, and it's the defense of free speech seems to come off as an attack on Islam. How do we get out of that cycle where freedom is an attack on their identity? Is there some Quranic or Hadithic support for freedom of speech, or do we need to just argue for secular values?
There's nothing in Islam that is pro-freedom of speech. There's nothing necessarily against it. There's nothing in Islam that says, shut up if we disagree with you or whatever. But there is a lot in Islam that's against... Actually, there is... Come to think of it, there is something against freedom of speech for apostates. If you leave Islam and don't tell anyone, Muslims say you're fine. Just don't tell anybody, don't talk about it, and don't spread fitna, which is like discord. I spread a lot of fitna. And so Muslims will tell me that's why I deserve to die. Not because I left Islam, but because, I can't keep my trap shut about this. So there's nothing really in Islam you can appeal to. But I think the appeal to secular values can work with some Muslims. Because you can tell them, with freedom of discourse and freedom of expression, then you have the freedom to practice your religion as you see fit. And I think the best example of that is the United States, which is one of the most religious countries in the world because we have freedom to be. Countries that impose a state religion aren't as religious as we are. And that's because, you can just open a storefront church, make up your own church. So I think appealing to the secular values of freedom as being helpful to religious people and reminding them that when you're not in the majority, you need that. Muslims in the United States understand this very well, living in a Christian majority country. Without freedom, they don't get to practice their religion. And so I think appealing to that can sometimes work. But sometimes you really can't get anywhere with it. I understand that. I mean, I've had Muslims argue with me that freedom of speech doesn't apply to hate speech. Well, what is hate speech? Oh, when you say anything against Islam. I'm like, well, there are things in your religion that call for my death. Is that not hateful? But they have a double standard there. They really do. So with some of them, it's just better to walk away, I think, sometimes, unfortunately. Yes?
I just read an article by somebody who argued that Christianity isn't any less violent than Islam, and there are many examples going from the Crusades to the witch burnings and Inquisition and so on and so forth. But even in our time, things like shooting off abortion doctors and stuff like that by Christian fundamentalists. Still, you can't deny that there are more terrorist acts by Muslim than by Christian in this time. But the article argued that the reason for that is not a difference in the religions, but the fact that secular forces are so strong in Western society, in government and in society as a whole. So my question is this: what can be done to strengthen secular forces in Muslim countries?
That's a good question. I hate to do this again, but it really depends on the country you're talking about. We say the Muslim world or Muslims and all that. Every country, every version of Islam has its own peculiarities. Every region has its own problems. Even when we talk about terrorism, there's not one narrative there. There are very different terrorist groups that sometimes even fight each other. The number one group that's killed by Muslim terrorists is Muslims. You're way more at risk if you're a Muslim living in a Muslim country than a Westerner living out here. You're much safer. I do agree that what we've done essentially is neuter Christianity in the United States. We've taken away its ability to really do much harm. And I think that secular forces will eventually prevail in certain countries. But right now, I think what we're witnessing is a huge backlash, personally. Because, it's very clear that their society is moving in a certain direction, and religious fundamentalists don't like it. And they want to do everything in their power to stop it. But they really can't. There are ex-Muslim groups everywhere now, and I keep bringing this up, but their atheism is hugely on the rise in Saudi Arabia, and that's the country everybody likes to point to and say that's where the worst of Islam is. And I would agree, there are allies, but they're terrible. They're the worst. But atheism is hugely on the rise out there.
But they just sentenced an atheist to death. Did you read that one?
Well, yes, because they found out he was an atheist. But there's a lot of secret atheist groups. The people in power want religion to stay so they can use religion to flex their power. But that's not true for everybody there. And eventually there's going to be a tipping point. Maybe I sound like too much of an optimist, but I feel like that's probably going to happen. And you're already seeing reform movements from within these countries. And so I think the best thing to do is to encourage those groups. Because coming in and declaring secular law never works. Turkey tried to do that, right? If you know about the history of Turkey, the Ataturk, he tried to force people to be more secular. He banned public veiling and all these things. And what happened? He bred more fundamentalists because they were angry about being told what to do. So if you get movements from within, more internal, more organic sort of movements, and they exist. They very much exist. That's why we're hearing more about, atheists being sentenced to death and things like that, because there are more people standing up. And, there are always martyrs along the way to secularism. There always are. And I'm not saying it's a good thing, obviously not, but, I think the movement is happening, and that's why we're seeing so much backlash. But yeah, encouraging those internal movements within those countries and within those societies, I think is the best way to really get them to move on from that.
Thank you. I have one other question, if that's okay. We have this guy outside here today who says that it's easy to be an atheist if you don't think about where everything comes from. And he's right. It is easy to be an atheist. What he doesn't understand is that it's even easier to be an atheist if you do understand where things come from. So here's my question. What is the Muslim standpoint on evolution and the origin of the universe?
It depends. I know I keep saying it depends. I know, but it's true, right? Every Muslim has their own ideas. As a Muslim, I was actually pro-evolution. I believe that was the mechanism of creation. There are a lot of believers who think that, because you can't deny that evolution is true. You can, it's just really hard to. You have to build a whole museum with dinosaurs somewhere in the Midwest in order to prove it, right? Even then, it doesn't do that great of a job. A lot of Muslims aren't as opposed to evolution as some Christians are because of the whole thing. In the Quran, it's not as specific about creation. The creation of people is very specific, but the creation story itself is a little more vague, so you can kind of wiggle evolution into there. But yeah, there are plenty of Muslims who are creationists, but I would say it's less aggressive. Most of the Muslims I knew in college were bio majors. They had to at least accept evolution for their schoolwork. That's at the very least. Although there is a very weird guy in Turkey, going back to Turkey again. He used to go by Harun Yahya. That was his pseudonym. Now he's out with his real name. And actually Broadly, which is a Vice publication, recently did a documentary on him. I would look it up. It's this weird, he has a weird fake feminist Islamic cult. And it's fascinating if you look him up. He believes that women are superior to men, but then he doesn't let the women on his show talk. It's really weird. And he wants them, and they're all bleach blonde with a lot of makeup, and like there's nothing wrong with that, but they all kind of look the same, and it's weird. It's very weird. But yeah, I would look it up. If you look up Islamic feminism cult Turkey, you'll find it, and it's very weird. But yeah, he's against evolution because he thinks that it leads to eugenics and fascism, which it sometimes can. We can't deny the history of eugenics, but it doesn't have to. I'm not a eugenicist.
Thank you.
I think other people should have an opportunity as well. Sorry.
It'll be a short one. So it's a follow-up.
Come on, man.
It's a follow-up question.
Come on. Come on.
Okay.
There are a lot of people.
Okay.
You
I just wanted to say that
Right.
as a follow-up to the previous question here, there is Jehovah's Witnesses and certain other fundamentalists, they actually discourage people from higher education.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something, apropos evolution and other things,
It
is that
is
something that happens?
absolutely the opposite.
Oh, yeah?
If you look at the Muslim community, especially in Western countries, but even in other countries, Muslims, as compared to other groups, have a much higher rate of education, generally speaking. So that's why I hate the argument that, all you need to do to become an atheist is just get educated. No. Plenty of Muslims have college degrees. They're all doctors and lawyers, and they have all these flashy jobs. Most Muslims have more education than I do in the United States. I got my bachelor's, but I stopped there. A lot of them go on to higher and higher things. That doesn't make them into atheists. And in fact, many of them major in STEM fields, the science fields that everybody thinks magically make you an atheist. That's not even statistically true. You're far more likely to become an atheist if you major in the humanities, believe it or not. Because in the humanities, your beliefs are actually challenged, as opposed to science, which you're like, okay, I'm learning about the world. Because people don't always put two and two together there. But yeah, Muslims do not discourage their kids generally from getting an education. Even girls. I was very much encouraged to get my education. My sister is getting her education. My dad was always for that. But part of that is that your degree is your bargaining chip on the marriage market. If you're trying to get married and you ask your parents to find a boy for you, if he has a degree, then they might want you to have a degree too. It adds to your market value in the marriage market. But that's true for non-Muslims too, for certain non-Muslims, like Hindus, Indian families basically. Any religion, there's the whole marriage thing there. But yes, go ahead.
This is a bit different, but there's one group of Muslims that have always had a good image in the West, and that's the Sufis. And I was wondering what role Sufism is playing in any Islamic society today.
There are a lot of reformers in Islam today who identify as Sufi. Sometimes they became reformers because they were Sufi, and sometimes they started doing reforming and becoming more liberal, and then they started calling themselves Sufi. Because Sufi Islam is they play a little fast and loose. There are Sufis who claim, I'm so close to God, I don't need to practice Islam anymore. I just have a really nice, close relationship with God. Okay, then, I guess. But as a Muslim, I found it sort of ridiculous. I'm like, if you have a close relationship to God, you should be more practicing, not less practicing. But yeah, there are a lot of Muslims who sort of couch their lack of participation in a lot of Islamic rules with, I'm a Sufi. They're the more spiritual version, I guess, of Islam. They're like the Gnostics or Kabbalah. They're kind of like that. But yeah, they do play a role. And but there are plenty of Muslims who consider them to be heretics for that reason.
Okay,
And part of why they have a good image too, by the way, is because they're a really small minority. Like smaller than Shia, even.
Well, there's also this Ahmadiyya group.
Yeah, the
They
Ahmadiyya
have-
group.
They have a local group somewhere. They have a...
Yeah, there's Ahmadiyya, there's the Zaytun Institute. I forget the name of the guy who runs the Zaytuna Institute, but yeah, there are a lot of Muslims don't consider him to be a real Muslim for that reason. Yeah, they're around.
Okay, thanks.
I have a couple little things. About a year and a half ago, we had a speaker about talking about the fatwas against atheists and the killings of atheists. And it seemed to me, and I pointed out to him, and he didn't believe, that the killings, the people who are on the left are the ones that are killed. The atheists that are on the left. Okay?
I'm sorry. I mean.
Well, yeah, like around Rushdie, the
Yeah.
people and people that are on the left.
Well, I mean, most Muslims who become ex-Muslims tend to be more left than right. Because if you're right and you're Muslim, you generally stay in your religion. So I don't know if that's a cause. It might be a correlation rather than a causation there. And there are some ex-Muslims who have fatwas on them who are more rightist than leftist.
Oh, they do have fatwas? Okay.
Oh, yeah. No,
Okay.
absolutely.
Well, I
yeah.
have looked at a few cases anyway. But my other thing is, there was a woman, Taslima
Nasreen, yeah. She blogs on the same network as me.
Okay.
Yeah.
She wrote a book about Muslim against women. Muslims against women. And, I read Salman Rushdie's book, and he put her down, calling her a piece of work. I hate these things, how feminists are called, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway. But, in Rushdie's work also, he said he considers himself on the left. He says he's a leftist. And he says it was our job to attack those fellow travelers of communism. Our job that he attacked. He admits that he attacked the left of fellow, which I feel is despicable. But anyway, getting back to what he said about Nasreen Taslimi.
Yeah.
I think it's important to say this. But I think it's. I'm glad for your speech, by the way, because one of the things it's. What's your question? I will get to it, and it's going to fit in. Your speech says that the Muslim religion is not all one way or another. We're getting a much better picture of it, much more complex. So her book, what do you think when you attack their Muslims' attitude towards women? Do you think that we should not be a part of that? Because, we already, as atheists, we already have problems. So I think it's probably best that we don't get involved in that. What do you think?
I think I have every right to get involved with it because that's my history, that's my background, that's my family, that's my life, People ask me all the time. Actually, recently it was a hashtag called ex-Muslim because. And there were a lot of angry Muslims coming after me because of what I tweeted on that hashtag. And, some of them were instant blocks. Some of them I toyed with a little bit. Sometimes I like to play with my food, right? And, they're like, why do you talk about Islam so much? You're like the crazy ex-girlfriend that won't stop talking about the ex-boyfriend. Like, why don't you just get over it, move on? I said, well, that was my life. I had no choice in it. I was born into it. I was raised with it. It sucked away my entire childhood. I spent my childhood in fear and anxiety because I thought I was a sinner. I get to talk about it, excuse me. But I would say that when we talk about, any social issues in groups that we are not a part of, it is very important on us to do two things. First of all, understand a little bit before we speak. And secondly, remember that when you look at an outside group, we all have this tendency, it's just a human thing, to essentially think of them as a monolith. To think, all right, I've met one Muslim, this is what Muslims are. And it's natural, we can't help it. But to sort of remember that that's probably what you're doing on some level. I mean, I do that with, let me think of a group I do that with. I do that with Mormons. I absolutely do. But what helps is that I knew Mormons in high school who, were different human beings and had different beliefs and different experiences, and remembering to just sort of humanize them instead of thinking this is what they're all like. And so I think absolutely we should talk about the social issues that plague our society, and even other aspects of society, even in groups we're not part of. But do it thoughtfully. That's what I think is important. And that's part of why I do what I do as far as talking about Islam.
Speaking of speech, in arguing with some of my more xenophobic friends, they've looked up the term taqiyya, or the permission.
Yeah, that's fun. So
I'm looking for a way to take that off the table. Either refute it or acknowledge it and blow it off.
So taqiyya is a term I never had heard in my life until I became an atheist and met anti-Muslim, Muslim bashing. I'm not talking about people who criticize Islam. I'm talking about people who want to exile all Muslims from the United States unless they leave Islam. They bring it up with me too. They'll say, "Oh, whenever I say anything that humanizes Muslims, they're like, you're not an ex-Muslim. You're a Muslim doing taqiyya. And taqiyya essentially means lying about your faith or your beliefs or something like that. I had never heard the term again until a rightist yelled at me about it. As a Muslim, I had never been taught the term. But in Islam, it is a thing that exists. But the idea is that you're doing it to preserve your life. So if they're killing all the Muslims and someone asks you if you're a Muslim, you can say, no, I'm not, to preserve your life. It's fairly reasonable, I think. There are some Muslims who sort of take it to another side, I'm sure. But it's not super common, I would say. And Christians have it too. They call it lying for the Lord, right? That's a thing that happens. So yeah, I would essentially bring up that a lot of Muslims don't even know that that's a thing, and that there are strict laws in Islam about what you can and can't lie about. Although there's some Muslims who say, well, you can lie to non-Muslims because, reasons. But who doesn't do that to some extent? Most political groups with an aim will lie to outsiders about what they're doing and why. It's a strategy that is not exactly limited to Muslims, unfortunately.
My question was almost the same. About lying to non-Muslims and then actually living in the society and just lying to them until you get more Muslims and you start killing all the Christians.
Yeah.
There are people who claim that's happening. As a Muslim, I was very devout as a Muslim, by the way. I was in deep, beyond deep. I still correct Muslims on their faith because I know more about it than they do. Which is why the argument that I just didn't know enough about Islam is laughable. It is entirely laughable. I immersed myself in there. I got as close as to being a scholar as a child and a girl as I could. But I was too young and also a woman, so being a real scholar would never be on the docket for me, unfortunately. A teacher or something. They have this whole thing where you can have a title, but it's not the real title if you're a woman. But anyway, there might be some Muslims who are trying to conspire to destroy the West from within or something. I don't think that's a super common thing.
Well, they scare us on TV, like Fox News would say that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Or, Stormfront and Breitbart and all those sites. Yeah, it's definitely a rightist xenophobic strategy. I mean, we saw this happen in the past in the United States as well, right? All people saying, in World War II, the Germans and the Japs in the United States are going to totally, they're trying to destroy the United States from within. Most immigrants don't come here to destroy the society. They want to be a part of it, right? My dad's family immigrated here because they couldn't get that great of a start with their business where they were living, and they were refugees, and they came here for the opportunity. They wanted to be a part of it, not get rid of it. I mean, most Muslim immigrants understand, and some of them will even tell you, if you're paying attention, essentially that back home sucks, and that's why we left it. Why would we want to replicate that over here? That seems like a really bad idea.
Yeah, I guess the real follow-up was, I've heard it said of the September 11th hijackers that they had believed that if you were in a non-Muslim land, Allah can't see you. So they're allowed to go to strip clubs, allowed to go to bars, and allowed to behave like Westerners without being sinful.
I have
no idea.
I've never heard of the thing where they think that God can't see you. That's completely false. But it is true that they did go to strip clubs and things like that. And I think they believed that because they were martyring themselves, all their sins would be forgiven, because they were making the ultimate sacrifice. Also, on top of that, in Islam, the sexual mores for men are much looser than they are for women. Of course, they are a patriarchal religion, right? Women aren't supposed to have sex with anyone who isn't their husband, or if they're a slave, their master, because Islam allows for slavery, just like Christianity. But a lot of these Arab guys especially, they'll come to the United States for their education, or in the case of the 9/11 hijackers, to be terrorists, and they feel totally fine with, dating, having sex with, or, seeing Western women who aren't Muslim naked because, they're not defiling the purity of a Muslim woman. So they don't care. And a lot of them will come here, they'll date, they'll have girlfriends, and then just go back home when they're 30 and have finished their education and abandon their white girlfriends and marry an 18-year-old virgin from a village somewhere. It's very common. Even though Islamically, Muhammad actually explicitly said, if you're not a virgin, you're supposed to marry a fellow non-virgin. And if you're a virgin, you're supposed to marry your fellow virgin because, the level of sinfulness is equal or something like that. Yeah.
Quick question about education and women. It's very silly. When you were a little girl, did you have to go to school to study religion and Quran, or it's just for boys, kind of?
I would say it's for boys and girls in most Western countries. Education for girls in a lot of non-Western countries, especially developing nations, whether it's religious or secular education, a lot of girls don't get education. That's a big problem all over the world. But if you're in a country where girls and boys are being educated, then you probably are. I went to Islamic school until almost high school. And Islamic school it was all the courses of regular school, but we had 3 extra classes. So our school day was way longer than our secular peers' school day. And some of us even went to school on weekends, Saturday school or Sunday school. Sometimes there was Quran night school. Yeah, we were in school a lot. And it sucked. It really did. I felt all my time in childhood was, mostly being in school and then doing homework and then practicing Quran. There wasn't a lot of time for diversions.
Speaking of childhood, do you remember any fairy tales or any type of books that your parents would read to you, like Winnie the Pooh or anything?
Yeah, we were pretty immersed in American culture. Before my parents got really religious, we used to eat Happy Meals every Sunday and get the toys and everything. My parents did read us some secular books, but they got more religious as I got older, so we stopped reading those as much. But there are, they have those children's Bibles. They have versions of that, except it's like compilations of good stories that are supposed to teach good morals to little Muslim kids. I read a lot of those. I even read books intended for adults because I just love to read. I still do.
I'm only asking because that's what did it for me. I became an atheist because I was exposed to Ramayana and Indian fairy tales, and they all involve gods and Greek mythology.
I actually took it upon myself as a Muslim to educate myself on other religions so I could debate them better. Yeah, I used to tell Christians, when they try to attack my religion, I would say, oh, your Bible actually says Christmas trees aren't allowed. It's in there, by the way. There's a verse about the man in the forest cutting down a tree and decorating it with shiny things, and you're not supposed to do that. But it's atheists who are ruining Christmas, not. Yeah. So, it wasn't really studying other religions that got me to become an atheist, but reading a lot helped. It hurt my faith. That's what I mean. It helped me become an atheist. The question I asked myself that really got me to be an atheist, though, was if I had not been born into Islam, would I have converted to it? And the answer was, oh, hell no. Why? Why would you do that to yourself? So, then I realized, I don't actually believe this. But go ahead.
I look at you, I see an Indian person, but you never told us where you're from and how did you become Muslim?
The reason for that is that I was born and raised in the U.S., and I'm not super connected with my roots. But yes, my family's Indian in origin. There are a lot of Muslims in India, and my family has been Muslim for as far as we know, for a long time. So they probably converted at some point a long time ago, but we don't know when. My parents raised me to be more Muslim than anything else. So, all the Indian stuff that you probably know about, I did not. You probably know more about it than I did as a kid. Now I'm going back and watching all the famous Bollywood movies, but as a kid, my parents said, oh, heck no, you're not watching Bollywood movies. There are people with their midriffs exposed dancing sexily. You're not allowed to watch that. Even though Bollywood movies, by the way, have very conservative values. They're very conservative. But, there's a lady with her midriff showing, wiggling to some sexy songs, so my parents didn't allow us.
One quickie, Reza Aslan?
Reza Aslan, yeah.
He's in your line.
He's what?
He does what you do. Talk about religion.
I don't think so, actually. I have a lot of problems with Reza Aslan because I think he presents a version of Islam that's much nicer than it actually is. He thinks that, he'll say, oh, Muslims don't actually believe that, and yet they do. And I think he's more progressive and more liberal, and he thinks that all Muslims are, and that's not true at all. I have a lot of problems with him. He also is tangled with me personally and other ex-Muslims a lot because he thinks we're just meanies. Why do ex-Muslims have to talk about Islam? Muslims are nice. I'm like, let's talk about all the other people who are mad at me for being an ex-Muslim on Twitter. Oh, but they're not true Muslims. I'm like, why don't you go tell them that? You guys as Muslims can argue about who's the true Muslim. That's not my place to decide who's a real Muslim. As far as I know, if someone calls themselves Muslim, that's what they are, you know. But yeah, I mean, he's doing some okay work, but I think you have to be honest about what you're reforming before you can reform it. And I don't think he's being very honest, personally.
Speaking of movies, could you comment on Islamic film industry? Not to be too general about it, but
there are media conglomerates in every country, of course. The one that I was most exposed to was the Western Muslim version of that. There's not a huge industry for it because there's not enough Muslims to really support it. But we grew up watching that movie, The Message, if you've ever heard of it. It's really cheesy. It's a great, like, old-fashioned historical epic. I would recommend it just because it's hilarious. But it's about the life of Muhammad, but it doesn't show Muhammad. But it shows all his other people in his life, and it tells the story fairly well. It's kind of like Ben-Hur style. You know, there's a lot of spear throwing and battles and things. Yeah, it's very, very corny, though. It's very cheesy. Yes, Anthony Quinn. He played Hamza, Muhammad's uncle. And he was also in Lion of the Desert, which is another movie about Muslims. There's a lot of children's programming, I would say. There's a Muslim puppet named Adam, and he has a show called Adam's World. And as children, we watched that. And it was like Sesame Street, kind of, but with Muslim stuff. So instead of ABCs, we had Alif Batas for the Arabic alphabet. There's a lot of Muslim singers, too, because in Islam, more strict Muslims won't listen to secular music because it has instruments and it's not about religion. You're supposed to sing only for God. So there's a lot of Islamic singers out there. There's a Muslim pop idol now. His name is Sami Yusuf, and the girls go crazy for him. I have actually seen him perform because my parents bought me tickets, and I thought, oh, why not? I'll just go. And yeah, I never really liked him that much, but there was a music video where he had a bunch of guys in suits. That was pretty good. Me and my cousins were deciding which one we wanted to marry. It was great. You know, teenage girls will be teenage girls no matter what religion says, right?
Hi, I was curious about Islamic views on divorce.
Yeah, that's another huge difference with Christianity. You know, Christianity has a checkered history with divorce. Some versions of it, like Catholicism, think you're not supposed to get divorced at all. Islam has divorce. In fact, for men, it's real easy to get divorced. You just have to say, I divorce you 3 times without being drunk. So if you're drunk, it doesn't count. Seriously, if you're intoxicated, then talaq means I divorce you. If you say talaq, 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 bam, you're divorced. And in fact, there's a lot of people who are divorced in my family. My dad's first marriage ended. It was an arranged marriage and it didn't work out. And he said talaq 3 times, and they slept in separate bedrooms and then got a legal divorce later. Yeah, it's not exactly encouraged. In Islam, they say it's the act by God that's allowed that's most hated by him. So it's allowed, but God really hates it. But it's allowed. And for women, which I'm sure you're all wondering, how does a woman get a divorce then? She's supposed to go to her local religious authority and essentially get permission for a divorce. So whether or not she gets a divorce depends on who the local religious authority is. My grandma told me that where she grew up in India, the local religious guy, he granted divorces to women like no other. He didn't care. The women would come to him and say, oh, I want to divorce my husband because of these reasons. He's like, it's fine. Go ahead. Divorce him. But then you're really relying on who that local religious authority is. If it's a more strict one, then you might be, out of luck if you want to get divorced. But yeah, that's the view of divorce in Islam. And if you're a woman and you get divorced, you're supposed to wait 3 months after you get a divorce. It's the same thing for a widow. You're supposed to stay at home for 3 months. And the idea, I think, was to make sure that if you turned out to be pregnant, that it was your dead husband's child, so they knew for sure whose child it was, as opposed to, if you go out and get married again or something, then who knows who's the father. Nowadays we have genetic testing and stuff, but but actually remarriage is very much encouraged in Islam. You're supposed to be married. Marriage is central in Islam.
One last question.
I was wondering, do you disagree with Sam Harris's or Ayaan Hirsi Ali's criticism of Islam?
I think because with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I really hesitate to say too much because she's been through a lot. The woman has lived through everything horrible. And I was born and raised in the United States, and I really have a lot of advantages that she did not have. And I grew up in a Muslim culture that does not, practice female genital mutilation and things like that. She's been through a lot, that woman. I have a lot of respect for her. But I think because of everything that's been done to her and everything that her life is like, sometimes her criticisms of Islam lack a bit of nuance. But I don't blame her for that at all. It's because it's a product of her circumstances. Sam Harris, I have some mixed feelings about, because I feel like sometimes he doesn't sort of make room for the less conservative Muslims. I feel like he doesn't want there to be Muslims at all. And so he wants to tell all Muslims that they should be terrorists, otherwise they shouldn't be Muslim. And that's not going to work. I don't think that's a particularly effective strategy. When people used to accuse me of being a terrorist because I was Muslim, or people would tell me that I belonged to a violent bloodthirsty cult, it made me become more religious, just to spite them. Well, not just to spite them, but also because I felt my identity being threatened. So, I think there's more room for progressive and moderate and liberal and non-practicing Muslims than Sam Harris wants to have in the world. But I don't necessarily disagree with all his criticisms of Islam. I mean, there's horrible stuff in there. Of course there is.
We're so glad that you were able to make it here. Wasn't she great? And thank you so much for coming.